Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying this video. Story 1. Ethan had always been drawn to the woods at night. While most people found the darkness suffocating and the unknown terrifying, he saw it as a sanctuary. The world slowed down under the canopy of stars, and the cool night air cleared his mind. His favorite trail wound through dense pines, the kind of place where moonlight barely kissed the ground, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional hoot of an owl. That night, Ethan's flashlight was acting up. He had noticed it earlier. An occasional flicker, a brief dimming, but he had shrugged it off. It wasn't the first time his gear had let him down. Besides, he knew this trail like the back of his hand. The beam wavered again, plunging him into darkness for a split second before snapping back to life. He clicked his tongue in annoyance and picked up his pace. Then he saw them, two glowing, amber eyes stared at him from the shadows, unblinking and unyielding. At first he thought it was a deer. It had to be a deer. But as he stood frozen, his breathing shallow, something about the way those eyes moved made his skin crawl. They blinked, slowly, deliberately, and then shifted closer. The figure surrounding them was vague, almost formless, but it was standing upright, tall and impossibly lanky, blending into the dark trees like a living shadow. Ethan's instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. The creature tilted its head, a motion that was unnervingly human. That's when the sound came, a low, guttural growl, deep enough to vibrate in his chest. It wasn't the kind of sound an animal made. It was too deliberate, too menacing. He snapped out of his trance and bolted, flashlight swinging wildly as he tore down the trail. His heart thundered in his ears, drowning out the crunch of leaves under his feet. But the growl followed him, joined by rapid footsteps that seemed to echo from every direction. The eyes multiplied. First there were 2, then 4, then a dozen pairs of glowing amber eyes emerging from the shadows all around him. They darted between the trees, keeping pace with him no matter how fast he ran. Not real, not real. He muttered between gasps for air, but the footsteps closing in told a different story. The parking lot appeared like a beacon ahead, the faint glint of his car's metal offering the only promise of safety. He sprinted harder, lungs burning, legs threatening to give out, until he slammed into the car door and fumbled for his keys. His hands trembled as he unlocked the door and threw himself inside, slamming the locks down as if that thin barrier of steel and glass could protect him. Silence. The growl stopped. The footsteps ceased. Ethan sat in the driver's seat, chest heaving, trying to convince himself it was over. He adjusted the rear view mirror to check the trailhead, expecting to see nothing but darkness. But they were there. 2 glowing eyes stared back at him from the edge of the woods. And then another pair, and another. They watched him, unblinking, as if daring him to step out of the car. Ethan didn't need another invitation. His trembling fingers turned the ignition, and the engine roared to life. Gravel sprayed as he sped out of the lot, the eyes fading into the distance. But as the miles stretched behind him, a chilling thought crept into his mind. The eyes hadn't chased him, hadn't tried to attack. They had just watched, like a warning, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that the warning wasn't for him to stay away. It was for him to never come back. Story 2. Grace Nichols was new to Maple Hollow, a small town where everyone knew everyone else, and everyone seemed to share the same strange warnings about the woods at the edge of town. The woods were old, tangled with vines and undergrowth, their trees looming like ancient sentinels. Locals would tell her in hushed tones, the trees out there aren't just trees. They whisper. They know things. Grace had heard her fair share of small-town superstitions, and this one seemed no different. She wasn't the type to scare easily. Still, there was something odd about those woods. They always seemed darker than they should, even at midday, and she couldn't shake the feeling that the twisted branches were watching her when she passed them on her morning runs. But she had bigger things to worry about than creepy trees. Like her boyfriend, Alex. Their fights had become a nightly ritual, and tonight's argument was especially nasty. He stormed out of her house, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. Grace, fueled by frustration and a stubborn need to prove she didn't care, grabbed her coat and stepped into the cold night air. She didn't intend to go into the woods at first, but the narrow trail leading between the towering trees seemed like the perfect escape from her swirling thoughts. The deeper Grace walked, the quieter the world became. The hum of crickets faded. The distant sound of cars on the main road disappeared. Even her own footsteps seemed muted, as if the forest swallowed every noise. She found herself in a small clearing and sat on a fallen log. The night air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. She hugged her knees to her chest, replaying the fight in her head. Why couldn't Alex just listen? She wasn't unreasonable. Was she? Grace sighed, her breath visible in the chilly air. That's when she heard it. At first, it was faint, like a murmur carried by the wind. She tilted her head, trying to catch the sound again. It came from the trees. Low, unintelligible whispers, almost like the trees were talking to each other. Grace shivered. It's just the wind, she muttered aloud, though the air was perfectly still. The whispers grew louder. She strained to make out the words. Stay, one voice seemed to urge. Another overlapped it, harsher. Leave. Then a third, louder than the rest, hissed, run. The words sent a chill down her spine. The forest didn't just feel quiet now. It felt alive, breathing, watching. Grace stood, her heart pounding. The log beneath her creaked, and suddenly, the trees around her began to groan and sway, though the air remained eerily calm. The whispers became a cacophony, surrounding her, drowning her thoughts. She stumbled back, her legs shaking. The shadows between the trees began to shift, twisting unnaturally. One shadow broke free from the others, stretching and growing until it took shape. It stood tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that bent and gnarled like branches. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a smooth, featureless void. It extended a long, spindly arm toward her, its fingers ending in sharp, twig-like points. Stay, the whispers demanded. Grace tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her legs felt rooted to the ground, as if the forest itself had claimed her. The figure stepped closer, its hollow form absorbing the moonlight. Finally, something snapped inside her. She turned and bolted, the invisible grip on her legs releasing just enough for her to stumble forward. She ran blindly, branches slapping her face and arms, the whispers chasing her. When she reached the edge of the woods, she dared a glance over her shoulder. The figure stood at the tree line, watching her. It didn't follow, but its presence burned into her memory like a brand. Grace locked the door behind her, gasping for breath. The whispers had stopped, but the silence felt worse. That night, she barely slept, her ears straining for the faintest rustle of wind. Days turned into weeks, but the encounter never left her. Whenever the wind blew through the trees outside her house, she swore she could hear faint whispers. Stay, leave, run. Grace never went near the woods again, but the woods didn't seem ready to let her go. Story 3. The wind howled through the towering pines like a distant, sorrowful melody. The group, 5 college friends eager for one last adventure before graduation, had chosen this forest for its isolation. Somewhere deep in these woods, there were whispers of an old legend, something about shadowy figures and ghostly chanting. But they were skeptics, bound by youthful arrogance, and the prospect of scaring each other was too good to pass up. By the time they pitched their tents and lit the campfire, the sky was ink black, the stars speckled like tiny, watching eyes. The flames danced high, their crackling warmth a comforting shield against the cold, creeping night. "All right," Chris said, leaning forward, flashlight aimed under his chin. His grin was cocky, but his voice trembled ever so slightly. "Who's got the first story? Or do I have to scare the pants off you myself?" Laughter erupted, bouncing off the trees. Mia rolled her eyes. "Go on, then. Make it good." Chris launched into a tale of a phantom hitchhiker, his voice rising and falling with the rhythm of the fire. The others chimed in with their own stories, some exaggerated, others stolen from movies. By the time their laughter had died down, the forest had grown unnaturally quiet. It was Mia who noticed first. "Hey, do you guys feel that?" "Feel what?" said Sarah, her voice edged with annoyance. "The fire," Mia said, pointing. "It just flickered, like something blocked the light." The group fell silent. Sure enough, the fire dimmed, as if a hand had swept over it, casting long shadows across their faces. The temperature dropped suddenly, the warmth of the flames retreating. "Wind, probably," Jason muttered, though he avoided everyone's gaze. But then they heard it, faint, almost imperceptible at first. A low, rhythmic chanting carried on the breeze. It seemed to come from all around them, echoing through the trees. "Chris," Mia whispered, her voice trembling, "is this part of your stupid prank?" Chris shook his head, his smirk long gone. "No, this isn't me." The chanting grew louder, closer. The words were foreign, guttural, and filled with an inexplicable dread. Jason grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the trees, the beam trembling as much as his hands. The light caught nothing but endless shadows. Then the fire went out, not gradually, not like the slow death of embers. It vanished in an instant, leaving them in suffocating darkness. "Light it again," Sarah hissed, fumbling with the matches. They tried, but the matches refused to ignite. The wind picked up, carrying the chanting like a sinister hymn. That's when Mia saw it, a figure at the edge of the clearing. It was a child, no older than 7, standing barefoot in the frost-covered grass. Her white dress glowed faintly, though her face was hidden in shadow. "Mia," Jason whispered, "what are you looking at?" "There," she said, pointing. "Don't you see her?" They all turned, but the figure was gone. Only the empty forest stared back. "Enough," Chris said, his voice cracking. "We're leaving. Now." As they scrambled to gather their things, shadowy forms began to materialize among the trees. Dozens of them, tall and lean, their movements unnaturally smooth, as if they floated rather than walked. "Run!" Jason screamed, and they bolted, leaving tents, bags, and sanity behind. The chanting reached a fever pitch, the shadows closing in as they tore through the woods. They didn't stop until they reached their cars. Nobody spoke as they sped away, the road twisting like a serpent beneath their wheels. The next morning, park rangers found the campsite. The tent stood upright, untouched. The bags sat neatly in their place. But the fire pit, it was still smoldering. The rangers scratched their heads. There were no footprints, no signs of the campers' hasty exit. Just the faint scent of smoke and a feeling, a heavy, unshakable sense of being watched. Weeks later, Mia woke up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. In the corner of her room stood a figure, a small child in a white dress, her shadow stretching unnaturally across the walls. And from somewhere far away, the chanting began again.